looking back, I see my faith as like the Protestant Reformation taken to its logical extreme. I didn't really have a home church, because anytime my parents kind of felt like either the worship practices or some of the beliefs or what have you at the church wasn't scriptural based on their interpretation of Scripture, then we'd pack up and find the next church. And sometimes that meant circling back to a church that we'd already been to before because we had some close friendships or what have you. But for me, from all the way up to college, I never really felt like I had a church that I was plugged into. But at the time too, I also saw but in the kind of context of an idea based on Sola Scriptura, this makes sense because we read the Scripture, and what a church is doing doesn't make sense to us based on Scripture, so find a different church. For a while there, we were doing home church. Like, we were kind of working through Scripture on our own, talking these issues through. I feel like growing up, I had a very personal relationship with Christ, and very scriptural based. So I remember spending as I mentioned earlier, like, we were homeschooled, and oftentimes I would spend a good, 30 minutes, hours or so doing like my own devotion before I'd begin whatever was my expected schoolwork. So, but I also remember having this, I think one of the most distinct moments I had in terms of my relationship with Jesus was when I was, I think like 15 or 16, I was starting to struggle with this idea of Sola Scriptura, and trying to, as I was kind of learning more just in general and in seeing certain inconsistencies and questioning things, but still I felt like I just remember having this distinct moment of like, I still had this firm faith in Jesus. And I remember even writing this down in my journal of like, I believe, I'm trying to remember the exact wording, but I believe, rather than saying the whole song, like, I believe in Jesus because the Bible tells me so, I believe the Bible because I believe that there's this Jesus. And so there's this turn for me where I started to kind of think things differently, especially in terms of how I was understanding Jesus and the Bible and my approach to it. Towards the end of high school, I just this distinct experience. It was like late at night, and I was just, I don't remember what questions I was wrestling with, but I just remembering having this kind of like calm faith that there is a Jesus and that he's died on the cross and rose again. But at the time, because I'm pretty sure this was the same year, I was taking some classes at a local Bible college in Birmingham. And one of the classes was just like a defense of kind of how we understand, how a Protestant would understand Scripture, and particularly a defense of Sola Scriptura. And I remember going into the class, like, my expectation was, okay, finally, now I'm going to get like the really clear, concrete, irrefutable answers to Sola Scriptura. And as I would hear the arguments for it, I was like, is this the best we got? Like, these verses don't actually mean what you're saying they're meaning, or there's this circular reasoning happen. Or, I mean, I think the one that always struck me is the Bible verse that's all Scripture is given by God. It's like, okay, yeah, I believe that. But that doesn't mean that, like, that's the sole measure by which we understand theology. Or it also, like, anytime you have those verses from the New Testament, I'd realize, but wait a minute, these are verses that were referring back to the Old Testament. So, like, based on our own logic, then the whole New Testament should be thrown out. But we don't. Like, that's central. So there must be something else that's, like, underlying and is the basis of our faith. And then there's this principle of Sola Scriptura. I was still going through this process as I was heading off to college. And I was also, I feel like, more aware of going through this process and making it my own. And I would just, when I started at college, especially because I went to a college far away from Alabama, up in Michigan, and I had this thought process of, there were aspects I was starting to disagree with the way kind of my parents handled their relationship to church. And one of the things that started to occur to me is that church isn't just about serving my interests, even if they're good interests as a Christian, but it's also about me serving the community. And so I had this desire to find a church where I could be of service and can use whatever talents I had. I also, during all my years growing up, had played the piano for years. So I thought, well, maybe if I find an area where I can serve in musical capacity. And then even if, as things go along, where I might feel like, oh, I don't know what I think about what the pastor said here, or I'm not sure about the music choices here, or what have you, I would still like make this commitment that like, I'm going to commit for these next 4 years that I'm going to pick a church within, that first semester, and I'm going to stick with it. Like, I'm going to learn to serve and grow with them. But at the same time, I'm still I was starting to think about how I'm going to approach my faith differently. And that landed me serving at a church where I did end up playing the piano because they needed a pianist. It was a very small church that was an Anglican church. I would call it really kind of low Anglican. And it was really basically a group of people that centered around this, one of the professors at the college who also served as the pastor. And most of the people in the congregation were some of his family members, his children, grandchildren, etc. And then a handful of college students. And I think when the Anglican tradition, there is at least this acknowledgement of the importance of this idea of tradition. And I think coming from my own background, it wasn't so Catholic. It wasn't Catholic. So I could be okay with that. Like I had heard about Catholicism growing up as a kid and the whole, worshiping Mary, worshiping the saints. So they weren't doing that, but they seemed to have at least some different understanding of Scripture and the faith that seemed to make more sense to me than my own upbringing. So the idea of tradition was very welcomed to me, that because it helped me to kind of understand that Scripture sits in that. And then I think it also helped me to see that some of the things we read in Scripture wouldn't necessarily be understood just reading from Scripture because there's this larger tradition that's in that contextualizes. I say there's two particular things started to move me from this being comfortable in this space of the Anglican tradition and pulling me towards the Catholic Church. So there are two things, and then there's a third thing that's like the kind of, I call it my Gideon's fleece moment. It was the moment where like, okay, I think, Lord, you're pulling me to the church. So the first thing was I was taking a history class, it was called, I think, Late Antiquity, which is like the end of the Roman Empire, the beginning of, it's kind of this time period of the Christianizing of the Roman Empire. But we also read, a little bit further back, we read Justin Martyr. And Justin Martyr's account, he gives kind of an account of a Mass, like the first Mass. And the way he describes it, and the way he describes kind of the reverence for the Eucharist, was so different than my experiences of communion growing up, and my experiences of thinking about it as purely symbolic, that I felt like I was, there's something more to this than it's just as simple. And then the next big moment was really just, I guess I wouldn't even call it a moment. It was more kind of a trickle. It was being around more Catholics and really cool, good, like knowledgeable Catholics who understood their faith. There were a lot of my professors went to the Catholic Church, and I looked at the way they lived their lives, and both in terms of as like family men, but also like these really cool, wise professors who had, would interpret history or literature or what have you. And so that just kind of was like drawing me. I think it was that personal effect that like, okay, this is not how I had understood what Catholics were like growing up. This is a group of people who actually like lived out their faith in a meaningful way. Growing up, a lot of my extended family would sometimes referred to as like cultural Catholics or the Christmas Easter Catholics. But now I was seeing like a group of people who demonstrated Christian faith in a way I was familiar with. And in that context, Scott Hahn came and visited college. And so when I got to hear him speak and then hear him kind of defend the Catholic faith, and especially, I think Hahn's charism is that he knows how to talk about Catholic faith to people who aren't Catholics but are Christians. I mean, that's where he's so gifted at, and it was resonating with me. But my Gideon's Fleece moment came my senior year, which was when this church that I had kind of chosen to serve at, it was the last week before Christmas break, and the pastor of the church announced that this was going to be the last Sunday. And he said the reason is because he, along with his wife, was going to be returning to the Catholic Church. And like all throughout college, I had been like thinking about Catholicism, and I had friends who had joined the Catholic Church, and I've been weighing it, and then now like the person who's been my spiritual mentor is like, yep, I'm going to become Catholic. Or I guess he was returning to the Catholic. He had grown up Catholic and left and was no going back. And I was just kind of like, I didn't have a church when I went back in January. And two, it was just kind of like a sign, like, this stuff you've been wrestling with, Michael, like, and keep coming towards the church. It took a year from that moment to when, I actually started to like go through RCIA, etc. Part of what held me back is while I was still in college and while I was still unmarried and like wasn't like quote unquote in my own house, if you will. Like the way I was seeing it is while I was still living under my parents' roof and kind of following the rules. I don't know if I was scared. I don't know if I was worried, or if I also felt like it was a sense of respect for them and deference to them. I didn't really want to do something like that while I was still living at home. And so my pastor rejoined the church that December. And then throughout that January, I was visiting the church. But then after I graduated and I started graduate school, then I looked for a Catholic church and started going through RCIA. And that following year, which would have been then, the December of my first year in graduate school, my wife and I got married. She joined me where I was living, and then we were stuck with the RCIA program and were received into the church that May of that year. So it would have been a year and a half after that particular moment.